Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the soundbites. Ben Kinsley is joining me this evening as co-host and co-producer. And could you talk about your show, your business just a little bit?
I can talk about
your
the show.
We know about that.
No, I do political policy, public policy advising, as well as government relations, a little bit of nonprofit advising for promotional stuff, like a whole bunch of different things.
There you go. And a lobbyist.
Lobbying,
yes.
Yep.
My guests will be excited. I'm a lobbyist. After all these years, I jumped the fence or something. But anyway, our guests tonight are Michael Donahue, who's Mike is the first vice president for the New England First Amendment Coalition. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
Guess what we're going to be talking about. And our other guest is Stephen Pappas, who's the managing editor of the Times-Argus. Steve, nice to see you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, this is going to be quite the evening. We're going to talk about free speech, hate speech, the difference between, this is my favorite, reporters and commentators. And you'll see it's a pretty complicated issue, so we're going to try to wangle through it and see if we can understand it, because I don't, and I think a lot of people don't, do they? So welcome, and we always ask you each to talk a little bit about yourself. Would you like to start, Michael?
Sure.
No stories about me. That's not allowed.
We decided that before the show.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no stories.
We told all the good stories ahead of time. Yeah, we can't repeat it.
No.
We got to go to new ones. But no, I'm born and raised here in Vermont. Actually started writing professionally as a senior in high school at South Burlington High School. I was working part-time in the sports department. Moved over to the newsroom while I was in college and just continued through and actually went back to sports for a little bit during the middle of the career and finished up in news and spent a total of 47 years at the Free Press.
Really? Wow. I don't think, I've never done that.
You've had so many jobs. You've had 47 jobs.
Yeah, well, in my earlier career, though, I changed jobs within a big corporation. So you were under the same benefits umbrella, but you just kept changing jobs.
Yeah.
That's sort of my shtick. Good for you, 47 years.
Yep.
And now, could you talk a little bit about the New England First Amendment Coalition?
Sure. It's a 6-state effort to try to help educate the public about the First Amendment. We do work, advocacy work. In addition, go to court in the states when there's First Amendment fights. The board is about a 35-member board, which includes lawyers, journalists, historians, just common citizens who are really interested in the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment.
Wow, here's a concept.
Yeah.
Well, we live by them.
Yes, well, we try. We try to understand them, and that's the key. I'm not sure we do that. Steve, you want to talk a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, proudly, I'm 51 years old.
Youngster in the group.
I grew up in Barrie and knew that I wanted to be a journalist from the get-go, and ended up going to school for journalism at the University of Maine because they had a daily newspaper there. Right out of college, ended up, I got into actually a legal battle that got me some national attention because I got into a copyright battle with Stephen King at the time, who was an alum of the University of Maine, and that got me my first job at a daily newspaper in Brunswick, Maine, and I made a little circuit of being there, got to bring down City Hall at a very young age in my career.
Wow.
And then became an editor at the Concord Monitor, so got a front row seat to national politics for 8 years.
Yeah.
Moved back to Maine for a little while, and then John Mitchell hired me as the managing editor of the Rutland Herald, which I did for 2 years, and then moved up here to take care of an ailing family member, and began reporting again very briefly. And then they foolishly made me the editor of the paper. So
I think that was a good move.
So, and I've been doing that now for almost 11 years.
Yeah. Steve and I keep in touch in the Price Chopper. That's where we meet.
That's where all the. It seems like all the politics in Central Vermont happens in Price Chopper.
Price Chopper.
Or Shaw's in Montpelier.
Or Shaw's,
State employees,
yes.
people you know.
Well, it may be depending on where you shop.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true.
No, but true. We've seen each other more there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Steve, you talked a little bit about what got you into journalism. Mike, what kind of drew you into journalism as a career choice?
Well, my father was director of public relations and sports information at St. Michael's College, and I guess, going into the newsroom, he would bring news releases down to WCAX, down to the Free Press, a couple of the radio stations, the old Vermont Sunday News in Burlington when that was going. And I just was fascinated by being in the newsroom, hearing the police scanner squawking, flurry of activity and everything
teletype
going.
screen.
The
Yes,
teletype
whoa.
clicking
He
away
didn't say
and
how
bells
old he
going
was,
off.
did he? Teletype.
No, they were going. They've been going hard
They were still going,
into the 80s.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just got sort of interested. I think I got the news bug a little bit. I was in high school, and actually a gentleman by the name of Rick Marcotte, the Central School in South Burlington's named for him, sort of took me under his wing and said, "What are you going to do with your life?" And I said, "I didn't know." And he said, "You're going to start writing for the student newspaper." I said, "No, I'm not." And we got into a fight over that, and he won, obviously, because he was a teacher. And so I started writing sports.
Fighting with people.
People in my life.
It's in his blood. It's in his blood.
So I started writing for the student newspaper as a sophomore. It made me the sports editor, and that's what opened the door senior year when there was an opening at the Free Press, part-time job.
Great.
What do you think is the draw for young people today getting involved in the news industry? Like, what do you see? What would the appeal be to draw a new group of folks into that industry?
I think it's still the same as when I got in there. There's nothing like being right on top of the news as news is happening. History is being made. As often they said, we write the first draft of history. So there's nothing better than to be there when news is happening. I've been fortunate enough to cover some of the major stories in the last 50 years in Vermont. When Governor Snelling died, which was probably, I'd say, is the biggest overall story that I ever covered because it changed Vermont that day. And Howard Dean became governor, and a lot changed after that. So there's something about being there. And the other thing is you get to fight for the little guy, and have done some stories where people just weren't being heard by government, but I investigated things, and lo and behold, things got turned around.
That's
and
great.
so it's a great job to be there on the front lines.
If I could piggyback on that, I would say that there is that inherent curiosity that people have, which is great. A lot of people think that if they can write, they should be able to be a journalist.
Those are not the same thing.
That is not the same thing.
Not the same thing.
But young people right now definitely are feeling like, it's a different medium than it used to be. It's not as linear as what Mike and I are used to, which is, you gather information, you vet the information, you get it ready for print, it goes to the press. Now it kind of has a life of its own, and every step of the way it kind of gets pushed through this rubric of being immediate, and so it's they're a different kind of journalist now, but the enthusiasm for kind of seeking truth and kind of teasing out information is still there in a very meaningful way. They're not as patient, I think is probably the best word to use, about listening and kind of getting people comfortable. It's a little more pressured because of the dynamic of social media and everything else, but they are inherently curious. They are principled enough and have that kind of that desire to fulfill the goal of First Amendment. And I mean, there aren't too many jobs that are protected by the Constitution, and it's once you kind of realize that you have that in your back pocket all the time, and that you're working in the public trust, it's pretty exciting.
But you also have a social media, I'm sorry, where it's instant gratification.
Yeah.
I mean, and you have so many words to get it out there, which is a whole different ballgame. Blogs, all kinds of stuff.
And that certainly has changed. And, if you told me, 20 years ago that, my stories were going to be up on something called the web, that I was going to be tweeting, whatever that was going to be, Facebook and all this other stuff, and that I was going to be doing videos myself, and that we were going to, instead of having an 11 o'clock deadline every night, that there was instant deadlines that okay, write 3 paragraphs from where you are, get it up on the web, and file something in a half hour with an update. And now it's so instantaneous, the news, and
we expect it.
Yeah.
Well, we expect it, and we
gratification.
expect it to be right, and that isn't always the case.
And that's one of the things I was going to say, because the way I primarily consume news, unfortunately, is in those, 140 character sound bites, which is not the ideal way to do it. But when you're running around all day and in between things, and you have 2 minutes to look at your phone, that's what a lot of people are doing.
Yeah.
And and I follow most of the time I follow reporters on Twitter or whatever, and that's what they're doing. They're doing those, here's where I am right now, here's what's happening. And the problem with that is you don't always get, this is a fully vetted story. It's here's the news as we know it, as it's happening right now.
Right.
Which is not how it's traditionally been.
Well, and you'll find that there are news sources who take pride in being first. What they don't tell you is that as you read through the story, you are then seeing incarnations of the story that were corrected along the way.
Right.
They don't. They don't tell you
edits
about
at the bottom. Like this was edited on. This was.
They don't tell you. They don't tell you how proud they are of all the adaptations it went through to get you to.
Well, that's
that
where we
final
came
version.
along with our tagline, which says "Listening Beyond the Sound Bites," because I think that's all people know is the soundbite. It's free. It's this. It's that, and they don't know the story or the rest of
And
the
I think
story.
one of the things that, we learned and we say in journalism a lot is, how do you know something is true? I mean, when I was at the Free Press, a lot of times on a lot of things we had to have 2 sources,
Right.
And they had to be named sources and things like that. And we didn't go with unnamed sources. It was very rare in our standard. And there is a saying in journalism, when your mother says she loves you, check it out. I mean, how do you know something is in fact true? And I remember the Amtrak derailment back in the 80s in Williston, and I was out there, and a couple of people died, and the AP reporter from Montpelier showed up, and he was trying to confirm how many people were dead, and I walked him through.
Right.
There were 3 over here. They had a makeshift, morgue that they were. And I said, there's 3 people that I've seen in there.
Right.
I know for a fact there are at least 3 dead right there.
Wow.
So, that was the only way. Now, you sure you saw him, and he asked me about 10 different ways.
For him, I guess.
But because he's putting his name on that story, he's got to make sure it's accurate.
Well, and the other piece of that is that people who want to get their side of a story out, because young journalists are so eager for the story, they tend to push things up quickly. So somebody who's trying to manipulate the story, get it out there, get their side out first, they become very expert at doing that and kind of going to the reporters that they know will push things out quickly.
Right.
And then it becomes kind of a game of catch up to get the
Because then
pieces of it.
they get to get one, because whoever gets their narrative out first, right,
Is
often controls the narrative from
playing offense.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
everybody else is playing
Wow.
defense. So a lot of
I'm not
times,
in your field.
well, a lot of times, I tell people all the time that for every story that appears in print, we probably have 2 or 3 other stories that develop over the course of the day that just don't prove to be true, because somebody's calling in or providing a tip that is not accurate in the least. And it could be something that we got from Facebook. People think that Facebook is a source of information. It's a source for some information.
Somebody's information.
Somebody's information.
For us to investigate.
Yeah, right.
That's all it is
Yeah.
a source to see if it
the
really is
beginning.
true.
Right, it's the beginning.
I always check I always, when I see a story and I want to respond, I go and check, is this true?
Yes.
On the internet, and most of the times it's not.
Yeah.
So I back
Well,
off.
and the other problem with that is that you can almost find anything you want on the internet.
Yes, you
Right.
can.
So-
that agrees with you or not.
Right,
but
right,
yeah,
yeah, exactly.
Right. Okay.
So today we're talking about some of the freedoms that are granted in the Bill of Rights. There are 5 of them in the First Amendment: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the press, freedom to assemble peacefully, and the right to petition government for the redress of grievances. We're going to mostly focus on 2 of them: freedom of speech and freedom of the press. What do those 2 freedoms mean, and why are they so important that they were put in the First Amendment?
I'm going to let the expert kick it off.
Well, and some of those are intertwined,
Right.
those 5 freedoms. I mean, if you go back and look at how this country was founded, I mean, religion was one of the big issues as to whether people would be able to honor a religion or practice their religion, and associated with that is the right to assemble. So
Right.
you can do it, but you want to do it with friends and everything like that. And then you want to be able to speak. You want to be able to print.
Yeah.
And
It is
you-
all there.
they
Yeah.
are sort of
I never thought of it that
intertwined
way.
if you
Yeah.
start looking at the history of it. And so, that I always love to tell people that's why it's the First Amendment, because it's the most important. And
Yeah.
freedom of the press, when they're arguing about, right to a fair trial, I go, now that's not in the First Amendment. That's further back,
Right,
So
right.
Yeah.
Cool.
One of the interesting things, too, that is an important historical context for the First Amendment is that the Constitution was only ratified because the founders agreed that there would be a First Amendment. They'd already drafted the language for it when the Constitution was ratified, and that was one of the deals for getting it ratified, is that they were going to have to go back and amend it with the First Amendment. This was already, it was already such a core concept to the Constitution that they knew they were going to have to go back and do this as they were signing it.
Well, I mean, and there's a reason that, as you point out, it's the foundation of democracy, because all of those things that Mike just described and the important role that we have allows for, it's all integral to community building, but it's all integral to openness, right? I mean,
Right.
that's what it comes down to, is that we all have that ability to be able to stand on the corner and express ourselves however we want to.
Right.
You start getting into freedom of speech, and you start getting into some pretty, complicated areas. Freedom of the press is pretty straightforward. I mean, that is, that we have that right. Like I said, it's great to have a job where you feel
Right.
like you're
Turn around, there's a whole country behind
yeah,
you.
exactly. That says, somebody needs to be gathering the information. And what I tell people who call up and say, hey, you're doing a crummy job, I thank them for calling, always. And I thank them for disagreeing with me. And I thank them for challenging the kind of reporting
Right.
that we're doing, because they have as much a right to do that as I have to put the information out there. And communities are only as strong as the dialogue that they have. And in this day and age of all this instant, information and
Right.
everything else, we actually have distanced ourselves from offering perspectives and having discussions. And we don't think critically enough. And we don't discuss things critically enough. I mean, we do in certain forums where it's forced, like the legislature, and forums where there's a public safety issue and things of that nature. But as a society, we certainly are not necessarily pushing our kids to sit down and consider debate and consider
Right, right.
philosophy and consider logic and all of those things that are those kind of the backbone of being able to formulate an argument. I have lots of people who call me up and tell me I'm wrong, and when I challenge them and say, well, I put 770 words out there to explain in an editorial why the paper believes that. What are your 770 words? They usually give me 2 words that I can't use on the
Yes.
air. And,
Exactly.
and what are
I
the
know
other
what they are.
768? You know, but they don't want to be able to do that. And that, you know, so we can talk a lot about freedom of the press and freedom of speech, but we then have to talk about, conversely, kind of this trend that I think we're all seeing toward ignorance and arrogance.
Right.
So
I'm sorry.
that's an interesting question, because do you think that's mostly being driven because people don't understand their own thoughts about an issue, or is it that they don't know how to communicate their own thoughts, or is it that they don't feel like they have the time or energy to explain their thoughts
Yes.
on an issue?
Yes.
All of the above.
I think it's all of the above, but I think a lot of it is that. So we'll fall back to what Mike kind of started off talking about, how they're all integrated, and freedom of assembly and all of these things are geared toward building community. Mm-hmm. Community is a dialogue of the people and an interaction of the people, and I think that we've gotten pretty far away from that idea of community. You can find a community of corgi lovers on Facebook, and that's that community, but that's a bubble.
Right.
That's different than the broader community.
I just see it as people are so angry. They don't want to discuss.
Right.
In many cases, it's my way or the highway these
Well,
days.
but that's
and that's what's happening.
the challenge.
Yeah.
And I think what I've seen is, you know, in the old days, you know, when I first started, say, you know, newspapers and radio stations, I mean, there was broadcasting.
Right.
It was a broad audience. And now, with newspapers, with TV, with radio, it's narrowcasting.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they have focused solely, depending on, you know, you can, on Sirius radio, you can get whatever kind of music you want, and you can listen to Beatles all day, or 60s all day, or whatever, instead of, by some chance, hearing music from another era or some other artist or something like that. So we're in a situation where people just are listening to
And the
what they
same with
want to
the
listen
news.
to,
You
and
listen
same
to
with
the one who agrees with
same
you.
with and same with TV. With some people watch Fox, some people watch CNN, MSNBC,
Right.
whatever your political bent may be. And I go back to, I told this story the other day to somebody. I remember when the CBS Evening News was 15 minutes long with Walter Cronkite. And in 1963, they announced they were going to 30 minutes. And I remember talking at the dinner table, how will they ever fill this 30 minutes? They're going to double their amount of time. Dad, how will they ever do it, you know? And everything like that. And they'll have enough. Well, but, you know, Walter Cronkite, Huntley Brinkley, I mean, they were respected journalists, and they just told it. And as I was taught, when you write stories, you write with nouns and verbs.
Right.
You don't write with adjectives and adverbs, and you don't label people. You just put it out there. You don't have to, you know, Rush Limbaugh. You don't have to say conservative commentator Rush Limbaugh.
Right.
Let somebody listen to him, then
They'll
they
figure
let
it
them
out.
say
Right.
he's conservative,
Right.
you know, or something like that. You shouldn't be the one labeling people. Let the viewer or the listener
I'm not that
do
sure
that.
that's what's happening these days.
Well, I was just going to say, I speak at different college courses occasionally where I get invited to speak for either mass communication or political science. And I always start the discussion by asking how many people in the room read the newspaper that morning. And that generation, nobody raises their hand.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say
And
probably nobody.
And I say, you know, hold up my phone. I say, well, how many of you got information this morning from this? And they all raise their hand. I'll say, well, where, you know, randomly ask, where did you get your information? You know, Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, whatever it happens to be. And then I'll ask, and where do you find news that challenges your point of view? Where do you go for different perspectives? And they all kind of look at me like, what? And they, you know, why would I do that? And I say, you know, well, so the algorithms on your phone and everything else are taking you to the things that you want to see all the time. You're constantly getting feedback of the things that you like, the things that you look at. And So that constant affirmation is only telling you and supporting how you feel about the world. And that constant affirmation is, that's great, and it makes you feel like you're included and you have a community, right? But you're in a bubble.
But it's not challenging.
It's not challenging you, and you're not broadening your perspective at all. And and then I'll say, well, so, you know what it's called when you get constant validation and you're just regurgitating the same thing you hear all the time? That's a cult. And then they all, no, it's not. It's not a cult, and you get into this little debate. And I'm taking it to an extreme on purpose,
exactly,
right?
yeah.
But that's good.
And then 15 minutes into it, some kid will always turn to the other kid and go, "Is it a cult?" And then they realize, and then they start to feel like I'm not, because then I always segue into, you have a civic obligation. And, the newspaper is very much that civic obligation of being a utilitarian tool to bring community. It needs to be a reflection of the community, good, bad, ugly, political party, whatever. Mm-hmm. So if we're doing our jobs well as a news organization, then we're providing different perspectives, whether people like them or not.
And they need to know what's going on in their community. And that's what I find scary, is that people have no idea. And you mentioned like something coming up at town meeting. I live in South Burlington, and somebody's like, what?
Yeah.
And it's like, we're having a big vote on,
Till they
a
dig the
$3
ditch in
million
their front
bond
yard.
vote or
Right,
something,
right.
and people are just, they're not informed,
No.
and that's what's.
How can we change that? I mean, what can your group do, and what can we all do? Because really, it's bad.
I'm going to take notes on this one.
Yeah, really. Pay attention. E.F. Hutton speaks.
If I had the answer, I'd be further along.
No, seriously, people have to be interested. They're only interested, I was saying, when somebody comes on and starts digging in their front yard, and they're going, hey, right? But otherwise, they don't pay attention.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's I'm working on a story for a newspaper that suddenly something is going to happen, and it's like, well, when did you guys all agree on this, and they're taking something down that may be historic, and, so there's a big fight going on now that's starting to erupt when apparently this was out there a year ago or something like that.
Well, we did. We were covering Act 46 a lot on this show, and we were going out to meetings and stuff. And just now, after it's been on the books, people are realizing the specifics of it, like you have to give your building for $1 to the new superintendency and a few other things, and they're going nutty. And I'm like, you know what, people? Maybe a year or two ago you might have changed this, but this train has left the station.
Well, and if you had been reading the paper, or something like
and
that.
They haven't.
So when you were talking earlier, and you said, in your generation, I have, regrettably, I'm going to say this out loud, I have kids your age, I'm assuming, and they are doing the same thing that you do. My kids don't want to read longer form anything. They want to just flip through, but they challenge me and they say, Dad, I'm willing to bet that anything that you tell me I can find faster than you can read the article. Find the information on it. It's a different way of consuming information. Yeah. It's not that it's different. We're affronted by it because it's so much different, and we've done it for so long that we want to sit down with the paper, and that's part of our routine. And I tell this story about my daughter who went to a job interview, and she put the New York Times under her arm into the job interview, and the only reason she brought it was she wanted them to think that she was smarter than she was. She brought the newspaper as a prop.
Good for her.
She got the job.
There you go.
But didn't read it. Had no interest
but
in
knew
reading
enough
it.
to know it was.
Went back to the store and asked for a refund.
Exactly.
That's
funny.
Unused.
So what I think, so the interesting thing is one of the freedoms in here is the freedom to assemble, right? And that's arguably what a lot of these digital platforms are doing, right? Mm-hmm. Is they're allowing people to assemble in a way that they weren't able to before, right? So connecting people across the country, suddenly your community, and this is one of the things I think we're seeing in Vermont to some extent, suddenly the community is not the physical town or the physical county or the physical state that you're living in. suddenly the community is broader than that.
It's like-minded people.
It's like-minded people in a lot of cases, because those are the people who you're oftentimes most comfortable around. It's people who think like you, who act like you or talk like you, people who love corgis,
right.
and are so. Suddenly we have
I don't,
these.
by the way.
Yeah, I love dogs in general, but
We don't care
I don't
a lot.
discriminate. But those are the communities that we're now starting to have, and especially this generation of millennials and the generation after them that are the digital natives that have grown up with this, and this is just normal to them.
Yep.
Right. And the problem, and you kind of alluded to it, is that you end up in these echo chambers of, so you may think a certain way, you may not have a strong opinion of it, but then you start hearing other people saying the same thing and it reinforces it. And that's one of the things I think that leads to that two-word depth. When you actually challenge them, there's nothing there because they haven't really thought about it.
Right.
They had, maybe a year ago, they had a thought about it, but they haven't thought about it since, because everyone that they've seen say something on this particular issue has all agreed with them, and they haven't had to go deeper than that.
Right. That's right.
So one of the things I'm very conscious of when I'm following people on social media is I make sure that if I see an interesting debate on Twitter, I follow both people on both sides of that issue. It's like, okay, both of these people are talking, make a lot of sense. They make strong arguments for their case. And maybe I do agree with one over the other, but I make sure I follow both of them, so that you're getting two sides, two perspectives on an issue.
I spoke at a college graduation a couple years ago, and one of the things I had talked about is, make sure that you find the information that you need and look at multiple sources. Don't just go with one. And I use the example of during the debates between Hillary and Trump, my wife and I, after the debate, we would tune into CNN, say for 15 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes, and hear how great Hillary was and how terrible Trump was. And then we'd flip it over to Fox,
Right.
and Trump was so stupendous,
Right.
and put her in her place, and Hillary was terrible, and what was she thinking,
Right.
and everything like that. And so you get these two sort of extremes, and then maybe flip over to MSNBC for 10 minutes and get a third perspective. But it was interesting, because you just have these
Right.
TV stations now on the channels that have just one opinion, and you're only getting it. And the fact that you're actually trying to find the second opinion
Well, that
is really what we need.
Yeah, that mindfulness is commendable, because that is not what's happening. And when you have to produce news, newspapers aren't newspapers anymore. We're news organizations. So everything we do, from the beginning of a story to the end, in the end, that's subjective, whatever the end is at this point. But everything goes through a rubric. You only give out this much on Twitter. You only put this much out on Facebook because it's free. And we want people to pay for,
Right.
what we're doing.
Right.
You
Right.
put some out on the web in front of the paywall. You put some behind the paywall. The last thing we do is produce a newspaper, and it comes out the next morning, and that news is typically 36 hours old. It's the
Right.
most dated thing that we do, and the demographic that reads it is dying every day, literally. That demographic is old people, an older population.
Right.
And if we have a heavy day of obituaries, that's cringeworthy, because those were subscribers.
Oh,
Yep.
interesting.
Yeah.
And,
Really?
And so that rubric, that thing that you're talking about of kind of engaging people at different levels, that's the challenge that news organizations like the Free Press and the Times Argus and the Rutland Herald have, because how do we engage you at a certain level and engage you and you
In a
at
timely
different-
manner, too.
in a different
Because,
level?
I heard that already.
And,
Well, and-
with limited resources,
Yeah.
because it's not like all of a sudden we have an army of digital people who do one thing and another army of people who do the production of the newspaper. It's the same people,
Right.
just being trained to come at it in
What
a
I
different
find
way.
difficult, and Michael was talking about it a little bit before, I used to have breakfast with a guy you might know, Peter Frame.
Yeah.
He and I had breakfast at Looning's a lot because I was working for the Merchants Bank next door. And we got into this discussion about the difference between reporters or whatever and the commentaries. And I find it difficult to read stories from people who are so clearly not thinking like I am and are just expressing their own personal opinions. And I think it's gotten really bad, where I would like to hear the news and make my own judgment. And I think that's gone.
Well, I think that people, the average reader, and Mike, you may disagree with me on this, but I think the average reader cannot discern between a news article and an editorial. People will tell me, you know, if they have a letter to the editor in the paper, someone will come up to them and say, "Oh, I saw your article in the paper."
Oh, that's scary.
Yeah.
Well, that's not an article. That's
his
your
opinion.
opinion.
They sometimes don't even know the difference with an ad, too.
Well, that's true.
I saw your article in. Article?
Okay.
No, it turns out it was
Was
an
it ad?
advertisement
Oh, my word,
for
right.
something. You know, they just...
Yeah, people don't, you know, and people assume, and this is one of the biggest problems. People assume that if it's in the newspaper, that it's automatically coming with a bias.
But that's new. That's not from years ago. Do you think, or is it
No,
farther back
I mean,
than I think?
Well, certainly in the whole time that I've worked for the Times-Argus and Rutland Herald, the perception has been that we are a liberal rag, which has nothing to do, I believe, with the news. It has to do with the editorials.
Maybe because I
historically.
knew individual reporters from the State House. I knew, and I mentioned one in particular to you, straight down the middle. And after he left reporting and went to work for one of the water quality things, I realized that he was very liberal, and I had no clue all the time he was reporting.
Because
And
of
I
how
think that's-
professional he was.
As it should be.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
I thought.
That objectivity, and
Yeah.
people don't think about that anymore. And people think that we're sitting around scheming about, well, how are we going to screw somebody over with our liberal agenda? We don't have time to do that. Nobody's
Yeah,
sitting
we
gotta
around
write
doing
the
that.
Yeah.
We're too busy chasing stories every day to sit
Right.
around and contemplate.
That's
Go
the
ahead.
thing. They think you have these great, you know, you sit in the back room and everybody's conspiring with one another, or
the
what can we
back
do
room, right.
about this, that, or the other thing, and you know, and
just
you're right.
trying to push
It's
the
great.
thing out.
Yeah. To be honest with you, they give us a lot more credit than we should be getting, because
No
I'll never
time.
forget, we were in the sports section one time, and I covered this semi-pro football game, and the lights went off in the stadium, and they couldn't finish the game, and so we had this the page, and it was all typed. There was no photo, so it looked pretty black and white
Right.
and everything. So the editor made a gray box out of this story just to lighten up the page or change it to just a thing. And I had this athletic director say, "Wow, that was good thinking about how you made it gray because the lights went off and everything like this." I go, "What?" And we were like,
Just
"What?"
say
And I
thank
went in
you.
and told everybody, and they're like,
Oh, no.
"No, it's just we're trying to do something for design purposes,
right.
and we did something." But people are like, you know, giving you credit for things that just aren't.
Well, I think, but to your point, Pat, I think that I do think that people, like even yourself, don't necessarily. It's hard to discern who is pushing the message. So the editorial page historically is the voice, that the editorial, that one piece
Right.
of that page, is the voice of the newspaper, and that is a message sent by the editorial board of the paper. That is the one place in the paper where there's supposed to be a bias.
Yeah.
And the letters to the editor and the commentaries
Are
are
not.
the reflection
Oh,
of the
interesting.
community. That's what the community is
Right.
feeding back to the newspaper as a broad base. The rest of it is supposed to be cut and dried,
Yeah, because
objective
I
news.
sort of got turned off by TV too, because instead of news reporting, they're doing all of this fun, sort of like a Good Morning America takeoff, where they have fashion shows and cooking and stuff, and like, no, I would just like the news. I'm going to work. Just give it to me. I can
Give me
handle
the
it.
news and the
Yeah,
weather,
yeah, let
and
me
I'm
go.
out of here, you know, and everything.
Yeah, it's
But-
changed. Everything's
but-
changed.
But when I started the Free Press, the editorial page editor was separate and apart from the newsroom. I mean, really, you know, had his own office and
Right. Ooh.
everything like that. And we got redesigned a couple of times, and he ended up being in the office next to the sports department. He was far away,
Right.
like 3 rooms away from the newsroom. And it always was funny. The governor would come in to meet the editorial board, and the only way we knew he was in the room, or was in the office, in the private room off the publisher's office, when you'd walk by, one of the state police
Oh,
Was pacing.
troopers, his drivers, was sitting there on the couch outside the publisher's office, and I go, Must be the governor's in with the
Oh, no
editorial
kidding.
board.
Oh.
But we literally, that's how separate and apart
Wow.
the editorial page at the Free Press was for a long, long time. Is that it was way away from the newsroom, so
Interesting.
that they were not. And I think a lot of people thought, oh yeah, well, is that editorial written by the reporter that covered it? And that most newspapers have a ban on
Interesting.
people who
Absolutely.
cover things from writing an editorial. at
Yeah,
the
I
same
mean,
time.
if anything, I'm the exception probably to that rule in Vermont right now, because I'm the assigning editor and I'm the editorial editor for both papers. So
So you assign the stories, is that?
yeah, so I'm
right.
assigning stories
Yeah.
and deciding what goes on the front page of the papers each day, and I'm writing the editorials. But that's
But
just
you're
that's just virtue
doing
by-
local.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I mean, and that's one of the other big changes I think through the years. When long ago, the Free Press front page was a lot of national, international
Right,
news.
that's right.
And the front page of the local section or the
Yeah.
B section was where
Local,
the things.
right, that's
Now,
Right, it's
years and
flipped
years
over.
ago, it's totally flipped over, and people, national, international news. Most of it is happening so quickly, and now you have 24-hour news cycle
Right.
on TV. Let them get it there. We're here to talk about the Vermont legislature.
And that's
or
an
something
interesting
like that.
dynamic, the White House, Washington, and news people, whoa. Has
Yeah.
that trickled down here to have an impact on how you do business in Vermont, the slight tension between the White House and the press bureau?
Slight?
Just trying to be
there's
politically
some-
correct.
No. There's fights every once in a while. Obviously, there's a fight going on currently with Bernie Sanders not talking to the Vermont Press
Yeah, that's been a
Corps
long
very
time.
often. Oh yeah, he,
Since the previous
run. That's gone on, and he just sort of shrugs it off. He doesn't care. He's on a national stage
Right,
now,
right.
and he doesn't want people asking him certain questions, and especially when his wife was under investigation by
Right,
the
exactly,
FBI,
right.
and I remember he was at one press conference. He said, "Oh, we're not here to talk about that. Next time we'll talk about that." Well, the next time
Gone.
has never come.
Yeah, right, right.
So he's a master at deflecting and everything like that. But there are times when Peter Shumlin wasn't happy with the Vermont Press Corps. There were times when Phil Scott probably hasn't been. Richard Snelling pulled out tape recorders after a
Yes.
while because he thought he was being misquoted, and he said, "I'm going to have
I
my own
remember
tape.
that.
My own
Yes,
tape,
right,
yeah.
exactly.
I'll have my own tape.
Yep.
We'll see if I
He
misquote."
was a master, that man.
But
Loved working for him.
yeah.
I would say that from my point of view, because I don't do a lot of reporting anymore, I'm doing more of the interaction with the public, the editorial writing, a lot of the outreach for the papers. I feel it in the sense of the reporters don't feel it and the photographers don't feel it. I don't think. I think they wish that the community didn't adopt this kind of fallacy that the press is the enemy of the people, because we're not.
No.
We're there,
agree with that.
again, we're there to serve the public trust, not to undermine what's going on in the community. And just because you don't like what you read doesn't mean that we're trying to do something to harm the community. That's just what we do.
It's hard for people to deal with is the freedom of expression, where you're seeing the flag burning, and just the other day the captain of the soccer team jumped on the flag, and you get mad as a citizen. I do, and it's hard to say, well, she has the right to do that in front of all these French people in another country, and you just keep getting madder and madder. But she does, and yet, like in Middlebury, when they wouldn't let the speakers speak, I think I just find that wrong, and nobody seems to do much about it. And I don't know whether I'm wrong that they're allowed to do that. Are they?
Well, I think, we like to think that we're a tolerant society here and that people should be allowed to speak,
Right.
even if it's not a popular point of view. You don't have to go. It's like turning
That's
off
right,
your
yeah,
radio,
exactly.
changing the
Turn
channel
your back,
or
walk
whatever, but, there's some people that feel that it's up to them to become disruptive and make shout outs
Right.
and disrupt any way they can. And, it's like, look, give them the chance to talk.
Yeah.
Let that person talk over there. Let that person talk
It's
over there.
not fair to the people who want to hear them.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think some of those groups often do a disservice to themselves.
Absolutely.
I think we
you
turn
know.
off. Whatever
Yeah.
they're trying to say, you turn off. Especially if they do it like in the State House when they disrupted a couple of sessions. It's like, forget it.
Yeah, I mean, they lose.
Right.
Yeah, I think the
Support.
legislators who have said, boy, I was sort of sympathetic to them,
Not
but
now.
if they're going to come in here and sit and disrupt and throw papers on
Right.
us and do things like that,
Yeah, I mean,
A little less willing to listen at that point.
Yeah, right.
they're
them out.
not reasonable people. So I guess I'm not going to try to reason with them.
I mean, what it comes down to is respect. I mean,
Right.
it's a respectful conversation, and I think that one of the things that I've observed, at least in dealing with the public through the lens of the Vermont Press, is that again, people, their knee-jerk reaction is to go to the path of least resistance in the argument. It's not necessarily to have a conversation. It's to tell me they think that I'm wrong, or that the paper's wrong. It has nothing to do with the actual merits of the argument. It's just, and I'll say, well, tell me why you feel that. And the response will be, if I have to explain it to you, it's not worth my time.
Oh, great.
Well,
But people don't even know how to do
What
that.
kind of answer is that?
Yeah,
Right.
that's not,
Yeah,
that's
that's-
a non-answer.
Right.
And so, but, I will always take advantage of that situation and say, you know what, though, I really appreciate you subscribing. Thanks for reading.
Good job. Yeah, excellent,
Yeah.
excellent.
Oh no, I always, every letter,
Thank you.
I responded to every single email, and people were shocked that I would.
Yeah,
It's
I
like,
get the
wow,
same
I'm
thing.
surprised. I'm surprised you took time to respond to me. And I go, you wrote me.
Right?
I'm going to take time to write you
for you,
back
Michael.
and
That's
everything
good.
like that. And I always
good.
signed off saying, thank you very much for reading the Free Press.
I just get, there's certain things that bother me, like the flag, because it's a symbol of the United States. It's people crashing crosses in cemeteries and knocking down. There are just certain things that really bother me, and I wish they wouldn't do that, and there's no way to stop people. Or as you just said, the impact it has on me, if they're trying to get me to do something, they lose,
Yeah.
because I don't get that.
So how do you balance that? Because obviously, if say you have a speaker coming to speak, that speaker has the freedom to say what they're going to say. The crowd that comes to see them has the freedom to assemble, and then if someone comes to protest, they also have the right to.
Right.
To say what they're going to say, but how do you make that balance, or how do you draw that line on where what one person is trying to say is infringing upon the rights of other people?
Right.
Like, where is that line? How do you figure out that balance?
If you're talking about in public, in an assembly, I mean, it comes down to somebody has to take control of that situation,
Right.
and the organizers have to be the facilitators, because it is still important to recognize there's a protest happening, but we're here for this thing. And as Mike said, if people don't want to hear the message and they protest, they just made a choice to leave because they're going to be escorted
Right.
out.
Yeah. So you
So
you
they-
can protest in the corner out
Right.
there. You have every
Across
right
the
to
street,
protest
like they
there.
keep those
Absolutely,
folks,
Right.
because you
funerals.
still have your say.
Yeah.
But again, there is a certain level of civility and respect that has to come with
Right.
the discourse. And to your point, though, Pat, there's nothing wrong with being offended. You should be offended by a lot of the things that are
Thank
happening.
you for that, Steve.
And
I'm offended.
and I think that it's within your right. I mean, the whole reason
Right.
we're sitting here
Right.
having this discussion is because you should be irritated by some of the things
Right.
that are being said and the things that are being
Especially,
done.
we were down in Charlotte, North Carolina, when they had the big, people just went crazy and broke windows and set stores on fire from their own neighborhood.
Yeah.
And we went the next day to kind of ride through. It was like a war zone, and I'm thinking, what purpose did you serve here? You felt good for a couple hours because you broke your neighbor's, put him out of business? I mean, I don't understand, and I mean, that's just, I don't even know what that is. I mean, besides
Well, that's
just
criminal. That's
Yeah.
criminal. But
Yeah, and I don't get it. You know, you're out celebrating Red Sox or Yankees or
Right,
whoever
right, exactly. Well,
win
next thing you
the
know-
World Series or the
Set the
NBA
cars
or
on
whatever,
fire.
and they're setting cars on fire, turning them over.
Yeah, what
Even
is
up at
that?
UVM when the Red Sox won, they, knocked
Did
down
they?
posts.
Yeah,
knocked
knocked
down
down.
posts and everything like this. And you just sit there and burning the flag. You mentioned everything like that. I know an awful lot of people that don't like that or see that happening, and it's like, we got to do something. And Vermont tried to pass a law, and nationally they've tried to pass a law, and it's always been struck down as just.
Oh,
it's-
not to burn the flag or
not to-
disrespect the flag?
Not to disrespect the flag,
Yeah.
and I get it, and I especially the military people
Right, well, we have
fully
that all in my
understand
family.
that, and it's just one of those things that freedom of speech really does mean freedom of speech,
Right,
and
right.
there may be some that will be offensive to you, and
But I have the
everything
right
like
to say to you, like you're
That
saying,
I'm offended by
that I'm offended.
Yeah.
that.
yeah, and
And,
the expectation should be that you would tell me why.
Right, exactly.
And
Right.
and I didn't know you came from a military family. I didn't know that you have roots, and you should be able to say those things to
Right.
me, and I should be able to say, you're right. I understand that. Megan Rapinoe also has the right, given what she's
Yeah,
going through,
right.
to stomp on the flag.
Right.
Right. Well, and Colin Kaepernick is another example of that.
Absolutely. And
He's got the right to kneel, and he has good reasons for doing that, and trying to get attention for it.
right. So, in talking about freedom of speech, though, again, conversely, our president is exercising the freedom of speach multiple times a day.
More so than anyone before.
and he's well within his
Yeah.
right to do that, regardless of what it does to the stock market and foreign
Right.
policy
Yeah,
and
what the
everything
heck.
else. But in my mind, it still comes down to it's okay for him to have the opinion. It is not okay to spread lies, to spread untruths
Right,
or exaggerations.
right.
And that's why you need the free press.
Right.
Because you need somebody. I mean, I'm always amazed when the New York Times ups that number and they say since the president's been in office, he's told 9,252 lies.
Right.
And somebody has to be doing that. Somebody who is a
Call him on it, right.
respected entity needs to be doing that hard work. And even if you don't agree with it and you don't like it, Fox News isn't keeping track of how many lies he's told. But somebody has to,
Yeah,
and
somebody-
just because
yeah, I
they
agree.
have,
This diatribe today about Britain was quite interesting.
So
mean,
one
wasn't the
other
United
thing we
States?
should talk about, is where is that line, and how do you deal with hate speech? Like when someone takes that freedom of speech so far that they're directing what they're saying at someone else in either a condescending or even an outright hurtful way. Like where is the line, and what is the recourse for that? Because it's not okay for people to go out and start disparaging other people.
And how specific should it be?
Right,
I mean,
and how-
I've heard some
yeah.
politicians want the president to his life to be ended, pretty much. And so, what could you say to make that hate speech? I mean, where's that? As Ben said, where's the line? I don't know.
well, again, it comes down to civility.
Right.
The web has become the place for anonymity and being able to hide behind the veil of the keyboard
Right.
and say whatever you want to say, and not necessarily answer for it. Actually, Pat, you responded to some comments online today about the homelessness issue here
Oh, right.
in Montpelier, and that thread went off the rails. It went sideways,
Right.
with people basically saying that it came down to people saying, we should not take care of the homeless, get rid of them, I don't want to look at them. We don't want to look at them. Well, that is...
David Kelly should take care of it.
Yeah, it very...
Unbelievable.
But the comments almost always devolve.
Right.
Right,
They
oh,
always
for
do.
sure. They go-
And all of a sudden, that becomes the new normal, is that you can have a legitimate debate that becomes a very explosive debate instantly, and people pay attention to the explosive debate
Right,
instead of to the merits of it.
Yeah.
And so what's the line? The line is, with hate speech, I mean, there's a difference between disrespect and hate speech. If it turns into a personal attack and name calling and, gender bias and race bias and sexual orientation bias all starts to become the target of the conversation, in my mind, you've crossed the line
That's hate
into
speech.
hate speech.
Yeah.
If you're talking about the issue, people are having a hard time getting their head around gender neutrality and gender neutral pronouns and things like that, and they're not getting it and they're frustrated. That's a legitimate concern.
Yeah, that is actually an interesting discussion to have.
But if you start attacking the person who's raising the issue
Right.
and accusing them of things that are just, you have no idea. You don't know this person from Adam or
Right.
Eve. And, the personal attacks start you very quickly down that road.
So once you start seeing those personal attacks, that's kind of edging towards, hate speech. What can you do as, an editor of a newspaper, or what can you do? What can the public do? Because there's protections for someone saying those things in a public square. Like, what recourse do you have to stop that?
They do it. They alert us pretty quickly. I mean, I can tell because I get email alerts when there are a lot of comments on. I can tell when something starts getting a lot of comments. I know. All right, here we
Right.
go, and I start monitoring the comments online. And when it starts to get to that point, I'll either shut it down, shut off the whole thing, or start blocking certain people who are.
I've done that a lot lately. It's just terrible. People that you've known for years, there's this
Yeah.
explosion. I'm like, what?
You
And
look
then-
at
Where do they
but
come
then-
from
Who
beyond
are you?
that?
But then I get accused of censorship. Then I get accused of trying to control the debate the way that I feel like it needs to be resolved, which isn't it at all. I mean, almost every news organization's policy about interacting on online forums is be respectful,
Right.
be
Right.
civil.
The
If you're
governor's
not,
office
what-
had a problem with that, didn't they, on their website? Because people were expressing how they felt, and I think some of the comments
Gun
were so
control.
bad
on
they.
last year.
It's
on
like
the
Yeah.
gun
They
control
did it,
issue.
and now, I think was it today? I just saw a federal judge said Trump couldn't do that either.
Right.
Oh, to
Because
take
Trump
them
was,
off?
Trump was
Oh, was he? Well, he
blocking
can't-
or
yeah.
or
So
doing something.
so this was an issue of they were blocking specific people as opposed to just cutting off comments, right?
Correct.
That was the issue.
Well, people were
I just saw the
attacking.
headline as I was coming in.
Yeah.
So
Oh, no, you're
See,
talking about the
listening
governor.
beyond the
I'm talking about the
soundbites.
governor.
Yeah, so the
Yeah.
governor, there were people who were being critical of the governor's position, and they allowed a certain number of them, and then it just became many of them.
Yeah, right.
And they said, all right, enough, we get it, you hate us, you hate the governor, we have a good sampling of those, now we're just gonna shut it down. I do the same thing with the letters to the editor sometimes, where if there's an issue, and somebody brings something up, then if we get 4 letters that are the same thing, I may not publish 3 of them
Right.
because
Interesting. Yeah, how many?
yeah, just
get rid of?
publish the one
Yeah.
that's the best written or whatever.
So I have to break the news to you. We are out of time. Does that go fast or what?
It went
Michael,
real
thank you
fast.
very much
No
for
problem.
being here.
Thanks.
This was a
Thank
great
you. It's a
conversation.
pleasure.
Steve, thank
Yeah.
you. Ben, thank
so
you
much.
very much.
pleasure.
Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week, and in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.